Hello, everyone. Welcome to the American Academy of Diplomacy virtual interview series. I'm your host, Grace Lundell. The purpose of this series is to share the experiences of Academy members with students and the general public in hopes of supporting the Academy's mission of strengthening appreciation for and understanding of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy. If you haven't already, please follow the American Academy of Diplomacy across all our social media platforms for the latest diplomacy and U.S. foreign policy updates. For the interview series today, we are joined by Ambassador John Beyrle. Ambassador Beyrle has more than 3 decades of experience in the Foreign Service, including as ambassador to Bulgaria from 2005 to 2008 and ambassador to Russia from 2008 to 2012. Ambassador Beyrle also served in Washington in various capacities, such as Special Advisor to the Secretary of State for the new independent states. Ambassador Beyrle received the Presidential Meritorious Service Award and the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, and is currently serving as chairman of the U.S. Russia Foundation. So thank you so much for joining us today, Ambassador Beyrle.
Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
Definitely. So for those listening, our questions will first focus on your career and then move into your perspective on certain U.S. foreign relations topics. So to get us started, just a rather general question. I think me and all of our listeners would love to hear why you decided to enter the Foreign Service. Were there other careers that you considered? Was there something that sparked your interest in the Foreign Service specifically?
Well, thanks again for having me. I'm very glad to be able to take part in this. I grew up in a fairly small town in the Midwest in the 1960s, 1970s, and the idea of a career in the Foreign Service was something pretty far from anything that I was pointing towards. But when I was in high school, I began to take foreign languages, first French and German, and discovered I had a knack for languages. So when I went to college, state school in Michigan, I began to take Russian. And I did a semester abroad in Leningrad in 1976, which kind of introduced me to the Soviet Union and life abroad at the same time. Then I worked for 2 years on an American exhibition, which was traveling across the Soviet Union. They hired Russian-speaking American college kids to act as guides on the exhibit. And that was under the auspices of the U.S. Embassy. So along with seeing a lot of the Soviet Union, spending hours and hours talking to Soviets, to Russians about the exhibit and about the world in general, I also got a sense of what it is that embassies do. I met a lot of Foreign Service officers. And at that point, I had been studying Slavic linguistics at the University of Michigan, thinking I might get a PhD and become a professor. When I went back to Michigan, I began to take foreign affairs, international relations courses. That seemed to me to be much more interesting. And that led to my taking the Foreign Service exam. And in 1983, I joined the State Department, and my first tour overseas was in Moscow, of all places.
It's perfect. Yeah, you were there when you were abroad and then you come back there. So was it really that experience just in Leningrad in Russia that really sparked your interest in doing foreign policy as a career?
Well, remember, this was also really the height of the Cold War. Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States were geopolitical rivals. They were our main competitors in space and nuclear arms race. This was the time that Solzhenitsyn's books, The Gulag Archipelago, were just coming out. So Russia was very much in the forefront of everyone's consciousness. And the idea that I could take the language skills that I had and apply them working at the embassy, trying to fashion some sort of more constructive or productive relations between these two giants that weren't really getting along very well at that time, it did have a certain appeal.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. It's a great challenge. And then also I feel like being in the Russian culture would automatically inspire that kind of interest as well as in furthering those relations. So thank you so much for answering that question. My next question was, what's the one aspect of being a member of the Foreign Service that you most enjoyed?
Oh, I think there's nothing that compares with working with a bunch of really committed, smart people as a team in a sometimes hostile, certainly non-permissive environment, trying to get things done, and the sense of service to the country. Both my father and my brother served in the U.S. Army. I never served in the military, but I definitely saw the Foreign Service, first and foremost, as service.
Mhm.
And probably over the years, what appealed to me most and what gave me the most gratitude was, I think, just the work that we did overseas with the team. I worked a lot in Washington as well, but being overseas and trying to get some things done, trying to figure out exactly what's happening in the host country, nothing really compared with that.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that the Foreign Service is really a great career for those who want to like make an impact and kind of promote their country?
I would definitely recommend it to anyone who has a bent for foreign affairs, who's looking for a way to serve. In the process, obviously, you travel a lot around the world. That's a bit of a downside. I had two kids. They're now adults, but they grew up overseas and got tired of having to pack boxes every 3 years and move. But there's an appeal to that as well, in that you never get stuck in a rut. You never feel like, when am I, I'm kind of in a dead end here. There's always a new adventure just around the corner. So I spend a lot of my time mentoring people, students who are interested in foreign affairs. And I always urge them to take the Foreign Service exam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely, like, I'm definitely considering it too. It definitely is such a great opportunity to really see the world as well as feel like you're doing something impactful. So it's a really great mix of those things. So you mentioned that you had, you also served a fair amount of time in Washington, not just in foreign assignments. So what were the pros and cons of both? What were the pros and cons of being in Washington? What were the pros and cons of being abroad?
Well, when I worked in Washington, I was very lucky in my career in that I worked mostly on the seventh floor of the State Department, which is where the Secretary of State, the undersecretaries work. And my first two jobs in Washington were traveling with the Secretary of States at that time, Secretaries of State, that was George Shultz and James Baker, as a staff officer, preparing them for their foreign travels, and then actually traveling with them, attending the meetings, taking notes, corralling all of the paper that flows to and from the Secretary of State when a foreign trip like that is planned. That was very, very gratifying and something that not a lot of officers in the Foreign Service get to do. So I consider myself very lucky to have been able to do that. As I said, the pros of being overseas are manifold. You do have a chance to represent your country, to do what you think is best for the interests of the United States. The cons, I would say, is that sometimes you're in pretty rough places to live. I lived and worked a lot in the Soviet part of Russia during those times, also in Bulgaria when it was a communist country. That was hard duty, not as hard as some people who are truly in war zones. I was fortunate enough never to have done that. But the pros far outweigh the cons, I would say.
Yeah. How did you cope with those more difficult posts? Did you have kind of a strategy to help you deal with that?
Well, there was a sort of all in it together ethic that the embassy had. The hardship really of living in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, 1980s was really just a question of supply. You wanted to be able to get enough food to feed your family, to get meat, milk and things which were sometimes in short supply in the Soviet Union. The embassy did a very good job of bringing supplies in to sort of fill in for what was not available on the local market. But a lot of our work or our away from work was strategizing on how to keep ourselves provisioned. And in doing that, we got ourselves out into society, going to markets, talking to Soviets, talking to Russians in kind of everyday walks of life. And that gave us all a very good feeling for the pros and cons of the system that we were living in at that time. The Soviet Union was beginning to crack and eventually, as we know, crumbled. I was there just at the beginning of that, and being able to spend a lot of time out in the provinces, being able to speak the language with people to find out what they were really thinking, if they would open up to an American diplomat, not always easy, was something that I don't think anything compares with that I've done in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That honestly sounds like such an interesting experience, like just being out amongst those people. And like, you probably, like, during the Cold War, you hear all that stuff about like what it's actually like in the Soviet Union, but to actually live it and experience it would be quite different. So yeah. And you also mentioned that when you were traveling around with the Secretary Schultz and that kind of part of your career, that you were very lucky to have gotten to be able to do that. How did you kind of get into that position?
Again, just luck, happenstance. When I left Moscow after my first tour as a Foreign Service officer in 1985, my wife and I, who's also a Foreign Service officer, we were what's called a tandem couple. We were posted to Bulgaria after that, to Sofia. That was 1985 to 87. The ambassador was a man named Ambassador Mel Levitsky, who was then reassigned from Sofia to go back to Washington and be the executive secretary of the State Department. And he asked me when my tour was over to come back and take the job, the staff officer job that I described in the executive secretariat. So he was really quite a mentor and a great influence on me. Still in touch with him, wonderful man. Went on to have a great career in the Foreign Service, ambassador in Brazil, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So talking kind of more about your positions in your career, what do you think were kind of the building blocks and personal characteristics that help you eventually become ambassador to Bulgaria and then to Russia?
Well, anyone who joins the Foreign Service and who is in the career for the reasons I described aspires at some point to be an ambassador. And the training that you get in the Foreign Service is really of two kinds. There is classroom training. I had leadership training a couple times when I was deputy chief, going off to be deputy chief of mission in Moscow. I did a 3 or 4 week course in what I would need to know to do that. That's all very important. But I would say the best preparation, the best training that I got to be an effective ambassador, and I hope I was effective, came from the role models that I worked for. People like Arthur Hartman, who was the first ambassador in Moscow when I was there in 1983 to 85. I was his staff aide, worked very closely with him, got to see how he did the job, a legendary American diplomat. I mentioned that I had the chance to travel with the 2 secretaries of state. When you're working, you're lucky enough to work at that level in the early stages of your career. You're seeing the very, very best that the State Department, that the US government, the US has to offer. I was also fortunate enough when I reached the senior levels in the State Department, just at the very beginning in 2000, 2001. I was working in the office responsible for Russia and the states of the former Soviet Union, and was a special advisor to Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State at that point for Russia and what we called the new independent states in those days. And the chance to work day to day with Colin Powell, see him operate, see him embody the very best of leadership skills, that taught me more about how to be effective, how to be a leader, than many 3-week courses that I took in the State Department, as useful as those courses were. Sometimes just learning, modeling the behavior you see from the very, very best people that you're lucky to be able to work with is the only preparation you need in some ways.
Mhm. Yeah, there is that thing. There's only so much you can learn in the classroom, and it's what you learn kind of on the job and from watching what other people do that can be really helpful and seeing like what techniques work and what doesn't. So, well, thank you so much. That's I think that's really helpful for everyone to kind of understand like how you kind of move up in a career in the foreign service. Um, just like one more question, maybe about your career. What was like the biggest challenge you faced when you were ambassador, either in Bulgaria or in Russia, and how did you deal with that?
Well, actually, there were a lot of them. One of the challenges that I faced actually first came when I worked in Prague as political economic counselor. That was the point at which the Czech Republic was working to join NATO. This was obviously the years, the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell apart, when Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic were the leading countries to be the first new entrants into NATO. And I worked hard in that job with both the Czech Foreign Service, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also, more importantly, the Czech military, which had a lot of work to do to get itself up to the level that was necessary to be able to be asked to join the alliance, because you have to be a producer of security to join NATO. You can't just be a consumer of it. And the Czechs were very well organized. They knew they had a lot of work to do, and they were extremely open to the help and support that they got from the United States, much of which was channeled through us at the embassy. So that was a challenge that was sort of headed for a happy ending. Mm-hmm. The Czechs obviously were invited to join NATO in 1999, and I was there when that happened, and there was some very big parties in Prague that night, I can tell you. In Russia, I would say the work that I did to prepare summits for President Obama, who visited the second year that I was ambassador, 2009, and then President Dmitry Medvedev made a summit trip to Washington in 2010, and I was involved with the preparations for both of those intimately, I would say. That takes a lot of coordination with Washington and with the host government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Presidential Administration, and the Kremlin. Mm-hmm. It was a time when the relationship between Russia and the United States was kind of at a high point. So it was possible to think about getting things done. And it just meant that we had to work overtime, because we knew that those periods in which U.S. Russia relations permit positive, constructive, productive things to get done don't often last very long. So you kind of have to make the hay while the sun shines. Yeah. The Russians, by the way, have exactly the same proverb in their language.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because you hear about you hear about the summits that go on, but you never hear the news stories about all the work that goes in behind those and all the preparation that has to be done. And it's very extensive. So, well, that actually leads perfectly on to my questions. I wanted to move on to a bit more about your perspective on certain U.S. foreign relations topics. Given your extensive experience in Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, my first question would be what do you believe are the defining characteristics of the relationship between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, the relationship between the U.S. and Russia is actually a very long relationship. Most people don't realize that we established diplomatic relations with Russia in 1809. So we've had relations with them for well over 200 years. In fact, the first real ambassador that America sent to Russia was the young John Quincy Adams, who later went on to become Secretary of State and, of course, President of the United States. And for the first century, from I think probably about 1809 until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the relationship between Russia and the United States was really quite normal. Two large continental powers who never fought against each other in a war. We never have done that to this day, certainly not in a shooting war, although we were adversaries in the Cold War. And I would say the relationship was characterized by pragmatism and by commercial interests. There was a lot of trade between Russia and the United States, especially the second half of the 19th century after the Civil War. Of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution, we broke relations with Moscow for a period until 1933. And after that, 33 until the Soviet Union fell apart, 1989, 1990, the relationship was fraught. There was a lot of competition, a lot of mistrust. There was obviously a period of 4 years during the Second World War when America and Russia were allies on the same side in the fight against Hitler. That's something that a lot of Americans don't remember that well, but Russians remember that well. And that's still a defining characteristic of the relationship for them, that we were allies in that war and that we've never fought a war against each other. It's difficult because the relationship between Russia and the United States is very cyclical and has been really since the beginning of the 20th century. Periods in which there's a lot of cooperation, in which the agreements that we have outnumber the areas of disagreement, are sometimes followed by very deep troughs in which America and Russia can't seem to find much in common to work on together or even to talk about. The good periods recur enough that we've even given them names historically over the years. The peaceful coexistence period under Eisenhower and Kennedy, détente, obviously under Richard Nixon, the reset that I took part in under Obama. And those periods usually produce results which are good for the interests of both countries. Arms control negotiations came out of those high points, détente and the reset. Unfortunately, the problem is that it's difficult to make them last. And when they begin to fall apart, they're usually followed by a period in which there's a lot of rancor, a lot of disagreement. And that, in a way, describes the period that we are in right now, as I speak, June 2021, to think which year it is. 2020 was a very long year for all of us. We're in a period right now where U.S. Russia relations are characterized more by our disagreements than our agreements. And I think it will take some time for us to build back to a period where we're actually getting productive and constructive things done. The meeting that just took place in Geneva between Presidents Putin and Biden were one first step toward that. I thought it was interesting that President Biden, in characterizing that meeting, quoted the old English proverb that the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. Biden and Putin began to make the pudding in Geneva, but we're not going to have a chance to taste it for many, many months, maybe even years to come.
Mm-hmm. So how do you believe, currently, Russia and specifically Putin view the relationship with the West? Is there something particular they want to get out of it, out of the relationship with the West, with America? Do they want to engage more? Do they want to engage less? Do they have a certain agenda that you see?
Well, this has changed a lot in the 20 years that Putin has been at the helm in Russia, in the Kremlin. When Putin took over from Yeltsin in 2000, I was actually at the first meeting that he held with President George Bush in Slovenia, the famous meeting where Bush said that he had looked in Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul and felt that we could work together, get things done together. At that point, I think Russia and President Putin were still measuring their success by the degree to which they could cooperate and work in a partnership way with the West. As the 2000s, the 2000 years went on, from 2000 to 2008, the first 2 terms of Putin's presidency, Russia and Putin began to look away from the West. There are a lot of reasons for that. Economically, Russia was in an oil and gas fueled boom. The average disposable income of Russians during that period, 2000, 2008, almost tripled. That's largely because the price of oil tripled or almost quadrupled during that point. But it gave Putin, the people around him, and the Russian people a sense that they were succeeding on their own and that they didn't need to be tutored by the West. A lot of what they had gone through in the 1990s, when Russia was on its knees, if not on its back, in terrible shape, and depended on support from the West, from the United States, that memories of that began to grate on Russians, on Putin, and the people surrounding him in the Kremlin as the years between 2000 and 2008 wore on. Russians are very proud people. It's a very proud country. And they wanted to be able to show they could stand on their own feet. And that meant pushing back against the West, sometimes when I would argue it was not in their best interest to do that. But that trend has really kept on, and I think Russia now would no longer define itself. Certainly the leadership in Russia today would no longer define the Russian project as becoming more like the Western democracies in North America and Europe. It sees Russia as something a bit more unique, playing by its own rules according to its own values. And in this, they're repeating a cycle in Russian history itself, which has been a struggle between modernizers and those who see Russia as a kind of unique civilization, which doesn't see its future really tied up in closer association with the outside world, especially with the West.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So just like one final question to kind of finish this off. Do you believe that a stable and predictable relationship per se with Russia is possible?
Oh, it's definitely possible because we have many examples just in the last 20 years in which we have been able to get productive, constructive things done, even at times when we were in great disagreement about other things. I mentioned that the U.S. Russia relationship over the years can be characterized by pragmatism. Both countries realize that they have almost a moral obligation as the two largest nuclear powers to manage their relationship in the most responsible way possible. And that, I think, will always, if not draw Russia and the United States together, it will keep us from falling too far apart, because the consequences of Russia and the United States being too far apart from each other could be catastrophic, even cataclysmic.
Well, thank you so much for talking about your career with us and talking about your opinion on Russia. It's definitely been fascinating for me, and I'm sure all of our listeners find it fascinating too. And thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.